September 1941. Le Havre airfield, northern France. Inside a smoke-filled operations hut, 30 German bomber crews crowded around a map pinned to the wall. The target that night was Hull, an industrial port on Britain's east coast. The crews of KG-30, veterans of the Blitz the year before, were confident. They had flown night raids across England for months in 1940 with minimal losses. RAF fighters had struggled in the darkness, anti-aircraft fire had been erratic, and German propaganda hammered home the idea that British gunners simply fired blindly into the night sky. Leutnant Karl-Heinz Schäfer, a Dornier Do 217 navigator, later recalled in a 1965 interview, "We joked that the British gunners fired with their eyes closed. Our commanders told us their flak was little more than fireworks. The Luftwaffe called it Sperrfeuer, barrage fire. German training manuals instructed pilots to ignore it, since statistically only a tiny fraction of shells would ever come close. That night's mission was supposed to be routine. Crews expected to see the familiar blossoms of fire rising in random arcs below, impressive but rarely dangerous. Confidence remained high. The Blitz of 1940 had killed over 43,000 British civilians and destroyed whole neighbourhoods in London, Liverpool and Coventry. Luftwaffe bomber groups had grown accustomed to striking without serious opposition after dark. But the RAF had not been idle. By autumn 1941, the British had quietly begun deploying a new technology, radar-directed anti-aircraft artillery. The earliest version, known as GL Mark II, gun-laying Mark II, had evolved from the chain-home radar system that had given Britain early warning during the Battle of Britain. Unlike chain-home, which scanned broadly for incoming aircraft, GL sets operated at shorter wavelengths and were capable of providing precise range and bearing directly to gun crews. At first, only a handful of batteries had the equipment, often clustered around strategic targets like ports and naval facilities. But even a handful was enough to change the bomber crew's perception of night war. At 23:42, the first wave of KG-30 bombers crossed the English coast. The night was moonless, the blacked-out city below barely visible except for a few scattered fires from earlier raids. Schäfer's Dornier droned steadily at 15,000 feet, bomb bay loaded with incendiaries. Through the nose window he could already see the flicker of gunfire rising from the ground. But something felt different. Usually the flak looked random, scattered across the sky, Schäfer wrote. This time the bursts followed us, bracketed us, climbed toward us as if pulled by a string. The pilot, Oberleutnant Ernst Keller, began evasive maneuvers, shallow banks and dives, the standard tactics to throw off unaimed barrage fire. Yet the black puffs of 3.7-inch shells continued to explode uncomfortably close. Keller muttered in disbelief. They see us. They must see us somehow. At 23:55, a shell burst close off the port wing. Shrapnel ripped through the fuselage, wounding the radio operator. Schäfer remembered the smell of cordite and smoke filling the cabin. Two other Dorniers in their formation were not so lucky. One exploded in midair, witnesses reporting a direct hit to the bomb bay. Another spiraled down in flames into the Humber estuary. By the time KG-30's first wave turned for home, 6 of the 27 bombers were missing. For a unit that had grown accustomed to losing 1 or 2 aircraft a week, the shock was profound. Back in Le Havre, the debriefing ran long into the early hours. Crews spoke of flak that seemed to track them, of shells bursting in patterns that were impossible to explain by chance. Major Wolfgang Falk, Luftflotte 3's operations officer, noted in his war diary, "Reports from multiple crews indicate British anti-aircraft shows uncharacteristic accuracy, suggests possibility of new detection device." At first, Luftwaffe intelligence officers dismissed these claims. German engineers knew of British chain-home radar, but believed it unsuitable for gun-laying. They assumed the British were simply improving their searchlight coordination, Yet interrogation of captured RAF gunners and later intercepted reports confirmed something more. An RAF anti-aircraft commander wrote in his September 1941 report, "Gun-laying radar mark. 2 has now been successfully employed against hostile night bombers in the Hull sector. Results show significant increase in accuracy, especially when combined with predictor instruments." The term predictor instruments referred to mechanical computers, electromechanical devices that calculated the future position of a moving target. Fed with continuous radar data, these predictors allowed British guns to fire not where the bomber was, but where it would be when the shell arrived. For Luftwaffe crews used to random flak patterns, the change was terrifying. German propaganda had promised invulnerability at night. Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda continued to mock British defences as ineffective, insisting that bomber losses were minimal and caused by accidents rather than enemy fire. But within bomber units, morale began to crack. Oberfeldwebel Hans Mertens, a Heinkel. He 111 gunner shot down over Hull in October 1941 and later captured, told his interrogators, "It was as if they had invisible eyes. We thought at first it was luck, but every night more aircraft failed to return. We never saw the fighters, only the shells bursting right where we flew." The change showed up in the statistics. In 1940, Luftwaffe losses on night missions over Britain had averaged about 1 to 2%. By late 1941, in sectors where GL radar was deployed, loss rates spiked to 5 to 6% per raid, catastrophic levels for units flying nightly operations. The RAF's anti-aircraft command logged a steady rise in kills credited to radar control. In the Hull raids of September-October 1941 alone, British AA guns claimed 25 German bombers, most confirmed by wreckage. Luftflotte 3's own records admitted losses of 31 aircraft in the same period. For German pilots, the psychological effect of radar-directed flak was greater than the physical losses. The night sky, once a shield, had become hostile. "We used to think darkness was our ally," Schäfer recalled. "Now the darkness belonged to the enemy." Crews developed superstitions. Some believed the British had invented a death ray that could lock onto aircraft. Others thought captured German technology was being used against them. The truth, a network of invisible radar beams guiding shells into their path, was hardly less unnerving. By the end of 1941, Luftwaffe commanders recognized they could no longer send bombers over Britain at night without facing mounting losses. The days of near impunity were over. What the Germans had experienced over Hull, Bremen and Wilhelmshaven in 1941 was only the beginning. GL Mark. 2 radar was crude, often unreliable in rain or against low-flying aircraft. Yet it proved the concept. By 1942, new microwave radar systems, far more accurate and resistant to jamming, would enter service. For Luftwaffe crews, the first shock had already arrived. Their expectation, that British flak was blind, had been shattered. Radar had given the gunners eyes in the dark, and the night would never again belong to the bomber. The German crews who limped back from Hull in 1941 could not have known the true scope of what they had encountered. For them, the sudden accuracy of British flak was a mystery, an unnerving sense that their secret ally, night, had betrayed them. But behind the scenes, in laboratories and workshops across Britain and America, engineers and scientists were rewriting the rules of warfare. The story began before the war with Chain Home, Britain's early warning radar network. Chain Home had saved the RAF in 1940 by giving Spitfires and Hurricanes precious minutes of warning before the Luftwaffe arrived. But while Chain Home could tell commanders that bombers were coming, it could not guide guns to hit them. That challenge fell to a new branch of development: gun-laying, GL, radar. The first model, GL Mark I, had been rushed into service in 1939. It was bulky, unreliable, and only marginally better than sound location. But engineers at the Telecommunications Research Establishment, TRE, refined the system into GL Mark II, introduced in 1941. With it, British gun crews could now measure not only the bearing but also the altitude and range of incoming aircraft, the holy trinity of anti-aircraft fire. Suddenly, the blind flak of 1940 became a directed weapon. Even as Mark II entered service, scientists were already building something revolutionary. In February 1940, at Birmingham University, physicists John Randall and Harry Boot invented the cavity magnetron, a device that could generate powerful microwaves. Unlike the long-wave chain-home radar, which struggled with accuracy, the magnetron allowed radar to operate at centimetre wavelengths. This breakthrough was shared with the Americans in September 1940 under the TISAD mission, a scientific exchange that transformed Allied cooperation. Bell Labs, MIT's radiation laboratory, and American industry soon began producing radar sets that were lighter, more accurate, and mass-producible. By 1942, prototypes like the GL Mark III in Britain and the American SCR 584 were in testing. These systems could lock onto a single aircraft and automatically feed its position into a predictor computer. In effect, they turned an anti-aircraft battery into a machine that could see through darkness and cloud. The Germans were not blind to radar. They had their own system, the Würzburg radar, introduced in 1940. Würzburg was in some ways superior to British GLMK. 2, offering high accuracy at ranges up to 25 miles. Thousands were eventually built. But the German doctrine used Würzburg primarily for fighter direction, guiding night fighters onto RAF bombers rather than mass deploying it to flak batteries. This divergence was crucial. Where the Allies invested in saturating gun defences with radar, Germany concentrated on its elite pilots. By the end of the war, this would prove catastrophic. Technology alone was not enough. It needed industry to bring it to the battlefield. Here, the Allies had the advantage. Britain, despite the Blitz, poured resources into radar production, deploying hundreds of GL sets by 1942. When the US entered the war, its industrial might amplified the effort. The SCR 584, produced by General Electric and Westinghouse, became the ultimate radar-directed gun-laying system of the war. By 1943, American factories were turning them out at a rate of 200 per month, each capable of tracking aircraft automatically and directing batteries of 90mm guns with pinpoint precision. Meanwhile, German production of Würzburg lagged, hampered by Allied bombing and competing demands for resources. By 1944, they had fewer than 4,000 operational sets, not nearly enough to blanket their skies. The British tested their growing network relentlessly. Reports from 1941 and 1942 note steadily increasing kill ratios as GL sets were integrated with predictors. In Malta, surrounded by Axis air power, radar-directed anti-aircraft fire proved devastating. Italian and German bomber crews complained that the flak over Valletta seemed impossibly precise. One Italian pilot captured in 1942 described it in disbelief. "They shot as though it were daylight. It was not like the fireworks over London. It followed us, always followed us." By late 1942, the trap was nearly ready. Bomber crews still flying missions over Britain clung to the belief that the accurate flak was a fluke, a lucky shot here and there. But in reality, they were flying into a rapidly maturing system. Radar feeding predictors, predictors guiding heavy guns, and soon proximity fuses that would make shells deadlier still. The psychological advantage the Luftwaffe had held in 1940, that night was their shield, was slipping away. Each month, radar multiplied across Britain's defences. Each raid brought more losses. The Germans could not yet see the full picture, but the pattern was clear. The darkness itself had been armed. It was spring 1942 when Luftwaffe planners returned to the familiar task of drawing arrows over maps of England. Targets were ports, shipyards, and industrial centres along the east coast. To the German High Command, the night offensive seemed the only viable way to harass Britain after the failure of the Blitz and the disaster over the skies of southern England in 1940. Crews of KG-2, flying the Dornier Do 217, were told the mission profile was essentially unchanged: cross the Channel at dusk, approach under cover of night, release bombs over Bristol or Newcastle, and return before dawn. Veterans reassured new crews that the flak, though noisy, was little more than a nuisance. "They can't see in the dark," a captain told his crew. "Just keep your course." But by 1942, that advice was no longer true. The first indication came during the March 1942 raid on Bristol. A formation of Dorniers at 16,000 feet expected the usual chaotic fireworks. Instead, gunners reported disciplined bursts, arranged in tight patterns that followed their evasive manoeuvres. Lieutenant Otto Weiss, a navigator who survived the raid, later wrote in his diary, recovered by Allied troops in 1945. "It was uncanny. The flak did not grope aimlessly. It reached up to meet us. Shells burst where we would be, not where we were. 3 aircraft vanished in fireballs within seconds. By dawn, KG-2 had lost 9 bombers. Losses of that scale were more than bad luck. They were symptomatic of a defence system transformed. The British had perfected the coordination between radar, predictor computers, and searchlights. GL Mark. 2 radar provided range and bearing, while searchlights locked onto aircraft once they came within visual range. When the two systems worked together, a bomber could be caught in a cone of blinding white light, while anti-aircraft batteries fired with radar-calculated accuracy. The effect was devastating on morale. Crews described the experience of being frozen in searchlight beams, unable to escape as shells bracketed them. Oberfeldwebel Hans Kruger, captured after bailing out over Kent in May 1942, told interrogators, "The beams moved with us. We could not shake them. The flak followed like a predator. It was as if the darkness itself had betrayed us." RAF records confirm this. A debrief from Bristol's anti-aircraft command noted, "Enemy bombers held in searchlights for periods of up to 4 minutes. GL radar enabled continuous bracketing. At least 5 enemy aircraft destroyed by coordinated fire. Nowhere was the transformation more visible than over Malta. The tiny island in the central Mediterranean was under relentless attack in 1942, with Axis bombers flying daily and nightly raids in an effort to starve it into submission. Italian and German crews had initially dismissed Maltese defences as thin, but the British had quietly reinforced the island with radar-directed flak, shipped in at great risk through convoys, GL Mark. 2 sets dotted the island, and by mid-1942, virtually every heavy AA battery was radar-equipped. On the night of May 9, 1942, a formation of Ju-80s from I/LG-1 approached Valletta at 12,000 feet. Expecting disorganized fire, they instead encountered a wall of precision bursts. Within minutes, 3 aircraft were burning. Italian crews flying Savoia Marchetti SM-79s fared no better. Corpo Aero Italiano pilot Lieutenant Luigi Fabbri, captured later in North Africa, recalled, "We laughed at the Maltese gunners before the mission. We thought they had nothing, but they tracked us in the dark as though the sun was shining. It was impossible." A British report confirmed that 11 Axis bombers were destroyed that night, nearly all by radar-directed flak. By summer 1942, German signals intelligence and interrogation of returned crews forced the Luftwaffe to acknowledge what was happening. Reports circulated within Luftflotte 3. Enemy anti-aircraft units now employ apparatus that detects range and altitude independent of visual sighting. Crews report unprecedented accuracy. Yet German engineers underestimated the scale. They believed the British had deployed only a handful of experimental sets, not realizing that by mid-1942, Britain had already fielded hundreds of GL radars across its defences and had begun producing improved microwave versions in quantity. The numbers told a grim story. In 1941, average Luftwaffe bomber loss rates on night raids were around 2 to 3%. By late 1942, in areas like the Thames Estuary, Bristol and Hull, losses climbed to 6 to 7%. For units flying nightly, these percentages were unsustainable. A squadron of 30 aircraft could expect to lose 2 each raid. Within a month, it would be gutted. The RAF's Anti-Aircraft Command noted in October 1942, "Radar-directed fire now accounts for the majority of confirmed kills during night raids. Enemy bomber losses increasing steadily, suggesting widespread effect on morale." For Luftwaffe crews, the change was more than statistical. It gnawed at their nerves. The night sky, once their shield, now felt hostile. Some crews began flying lower to escape radar detection, but this only brought them within range of light flak and made navigation harder. Others tried to scatter instead of maintaining formation, which reduced bombing accuracy and effectiveness. By winter 1942, superstitions had taken hold. Crews whispered about ghost lights that guided the guns, or secret British death beams. A captured navigator from KG-54 insisted that the British had developed a weapon that could read our minds and follow our course. In reality, it was nothing more exotic than electromagnetic waves, mathematics, and industrial-scale production. But for the men under fire, the effect was indistinguishable from sorcery. German propaganda continued to insist that British defences were impotent. Goebbels' press described night raids as successes, minimising losses and mocking British AA fire as futile. Yet inside Luftwaffe squadrons, reality could not be hidden. The empty bunks after each mission told the truth. In December 1942, Luftflotte 3 headquarters noted bluntly, "Loss rates increasing to unsustainable levels. Night bombing offensive over Britain cannot be maintained at current tempo." What had begun in 1941 as an unsettling surprise had, by 1942, become a systemic threat. Radar-directed guns had stripped away the night's protective cloak. The nightmare was only beginning. The GL Mark. 2 sets that unnerved German crews in 1942 were already on the verge of being replaced. The new microwave radars, combined with predictor computers and, soon, proximity fuses, would make anti-aircraft fire even more lethal. The Luftwaffe's assumption that night offered safety was gone. By the end of 1942, bomber crews whispered the same phrase after every mission. They can see in the dark. And in truth, they could. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, the U.S. Army's anti-aircraft defenses were still rooted in visual observation. Crews relied on sound locators, optical rangefinders, and manual predictors. Against slow, high-flying bombers, these tools could occasionally suffice. Against fast, low-flying aircraft or night raids, they were nearly useless. But the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor exposed the urgency of modern air defense. In the aftermath, as the Pacific War expanded and the European commitment deepened, American engineers rushed to match and then surpass the British in radar-directed anti-aircraft gunnery. Within 2 years, the transformation was complete. By 1943, USAA defenses no longer fired blind. The first major American radar for gun laying was the SCR-268, fielded experimentally in 1941 and rushed into production after Pearl Harbor. The bulky set could track aircraft at ranges up to 22,000 yards, providing range and azimuth data to heavy AA guns. In theory, it could direct searchlights as well as 90mm guns. In practice, it was temperamental. Operators complained about interference, calibration drift, and difficulty tracking low-altitude targets. Still, it was the beginning of radar-driven fire. An after-action report from the 200th Coast Artillery, AA, defending Manila in December 1941, noted, 268 radar provided warning of incoming raids, but gunnery remained largely ineffective due to lack of predictor integration. The lessons were bitter. Radar had potential, but without reliable computers and disciplined crews, accuracy was elusive. The breakthrough came in 1942-43 with the development of the SCR-584 microwave radar. Compact, truck-mounted and astonishingly precise, it used the cavity magnetron technology Britain had shared with the United States in the famous Tizard mission. Unlike the SCR-268, which required skilled operators to interpret blips, the 584 provided automatic tracking. It could lock onto a target and follow it, feeding continuous range, azimuth, and elevation data into the M9 director, an electromechanical fire control computer. Together, radar and predictor transformed anti-aircraft batteries into machines of mathematical precision. Brigadier General Claire Hibbs Armstrong, head of Anti-Aircraft Command, described the first field trials in 1943. For the first time in history, guns fired at a position the airplane would occupy, not where it had been seen. The result was devastating. The 584 reached the field just in time for the Tunisian campaign. German and Italian air forces still attempted night raids against Allied ports and supply dumps, believing darkness gave them safety. At Bizerte in spring 1943, they discovered otherwise. On the night of April 30th, 12 Ju-88 bombers from KG-54 crossed the coastline. Within minutes, radar picked them up. Searchlights guided by the SCR-584 held 3 bombers steady, while 90mm batteries, fed data by the M9 director, bracketed the formations. American gunners reported unprecedented accuracy. "Shells burst right on them," one sergeant wrote. "Not chasing shadows, not guessing." "We were walking the fire straight into their bellies. 5 bombers fell in flames. The rest scattered in panic." Captured Luftwaffe records later confirmed their astonishment. A KG-54 war diary entry read, "Enemy flak at Bizerte displayed uncanny precision. Losses severe. Crews report being tracked continuously as if under daylight observation." By July 1943, during Operation Husky, American radar-directed flak was fully operational. The SCR-584 accompanied the invasion fleet, mounted on landing ships and set up quickly on shore. German and Italian air attacks against the beaches ran into radar-guided barrages that tore formations apart. U.S. Navy reports noted that shore-based AA units equipped with the 584 achieved higher kill rates than ships firing visually. One Italian pilot, interrogated after being shot down near Gela, said simply, "Your guns knew where we were before we did." In Italy that autumn, German bombers attempting to strike Naples and Salerno found the same unwelcome surprise. By late 1943, Luftwaffe night raids on Allied-held ports had become suicidal. Radar had stripped away the darkness. The US also deployed radar-controlled AA at home. By 1943, major coastal cities like New York, Los Angeles, and San Francisco bristled with SCR-584S linked to 90mm batteries. Though Japanese and German bombers never reached the American mainland, the defenses represented a revolution in doctrine. The continental US was now shielded by an invisible electronic web. Training camps across the country drilled thousands of AA gunners in the new methods. The Army's anti-aircraft artillery school at Camp Davis, North Carolina, integrated radar into every exercise. By the end of 1943, radar fire control was no longer exotic. It was standard. For German bomber crews, the impact of America's adoption of radar-guided flak was devastating. Losses mounted in Italy and reports filtering back to Luftwaffe headquarters told the same story heard over Britain in 1941-42. The enemy can see in the dark. Japanese aviators too encountered it in the Pacific. At Guadalcanal, then later in the Solomons and Gilberts, they flew into radar-directed AA fire that shredded formations with unanswerable accuracy. A post-war Japanese officer, interrogated in 1946, recalled, "Our crews returned, saying the Americans had machines that followed them without light. We assumed it was exaggeration, until losses proved otherwise." Statistics confirm the transformation. In 1942, US AA effectiveness against night raids was negligible, less than 1% of attacking aircraft shot down. By late 1943, with SCR 584 and M9 Director integration, kill rates in defended zones rose to 10 to 15% per raid, comparable to or exceeding RAF results in Britain. By 1944, when proximity fuses joined the system, effectiveness doubled again. But even before that, radar had already forced Axis commanders to reconsider the viability of night bombing altogether. For American gunners, radar was more than technology, it was empowerment. Crews who once fired blindly now felt they had the upper hand. Morale soared. "Before, it was luck," one gunner said after a Sicilian engagement. "Now it's math." For Axis crews, morale sank. The night, their refuge, had turned into a trap. Every searchlight beam felt guided by unseen eyes. Every shell seemed to anticipate their course. By the end of 1943, German and Japanese officers alike recognized the truth. Radar-directed flak had made traditional night raids obsolete. As 1943 closed, the United States stood fully integrated into the radar-controlled war of attrition in the skies. What Britain had pioneered in 1941, America had scaled with its industrial might. By 1944, thousands of radar sets, predictors, and heavy guns would form a defensive grid across two oceans. The enemy's expectation of darkness as protection was gone forever. By 1944, German bomber crews no longer regarded night missions against Britain or Allied-held ports with casual confidence. The radar-controlled flak they had faced since 1941 had eroded morale, raised losses, and turned every raid into a gamble. Yet in early 1944, the equation tilted from unfavourable to catastrophic. That year, radar-guided fire was joined by a new weapon, the proximity fuse, or VT fuse. Instead of requiring a shell to score a direct hit, the fuse detonated automatically when it came near an aircraft, triggered by miniature radar built inside the shell itself. When combined with the SCR 584 radar and the M9 Director, the effect was devastating. For the first time, anti-aircraft guns could fire with mathematical accuracy and destroy targets even if their aim was slightly off. It was as if the sky itself had become electrified. The proximity fuse was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war. Developed in the United States by the National Defense Research Committee, it placed a tiny radio transmitter and receiver inside an artillery shell. When the shell passed close enough to an aircraft, the reflected radio waves triggered detonation. The fuse was expensive and technically complex, but its impact was beyond measure. Admiral Lewis L. Strauss later called it second only to the atomic bomb in importance. At first, the VT fuse was restricted to naval use, where it proved its worth against Japanese dive bombers and kamikazes. By late 1943, US Navy ships in the Pacific were destroying attackers with unheard-of efficiency. But in early 1944, the Army began issuing VT fuses to its anti-aircraft units in Europe. The timing was critical. The Luftwaffe was preparing massive raids to counter the Allied build-up for the invasion of France. The first confirmed use of radar-directed guns with VT fuses against the Luftwaffe came in February 1944. During raids against Allied air bases in southern England, German Ju-80s and Do-200s and 17s suddenly faced flak of an entirely new character. Leutnant Karl Brenner of KG-6 described the shock in his diary, later captured by US forces. The fire was everywhere. Shells exploded not near, but on top of us, beside us, beneath us. Not like before, not bracketing, not guessing. They burst exactly where we flew. RAF reports confirm the dramatic change. A debrief from the 76th Heavy AA Regiment noted, enemy bomber formation disintegrated within moments of radar predictor-controlled salvos using VT fuses. At least 6 aircraft destroyed in a single engagement. For Luftwaffe crews, losses jumped from heavy to annihilating. The true unveiling came during the Normandy invasion in June 1944. Allied planners feared the Luftwaffe might cripple the beaches with night raids. Instead, radar-directed guns with VT fuses created what pilots called a death zone. Hundreds of 90mm and 3.7-inch AA guns, linked to SCR-584 radar and M9 directors, ringed the beaches and anchored the invasion fleet offshore. Every shell carried a proximity fuse. On the night of June 7th, a formation of Heinkel He-11s attempted to strike Allied shipping off Omaha Beach. SCR-584 sets picked them up immediately. Searchlights swept the sky, and within seconds the guns opened fire. Shells exploded all around the bombers, bursting with mathematical precision. An Allied after-action report stated, within 3 minutes 5 enemy bombers destroyed. Remaining aircraft turned away in confusion. No bombs reached their targets. Captured German testimony confirmed the shock. Oberleutnant Dieter Hellwig, taken prisoner after bailing out near Caen, told interrogators, "The fire was like nothing we had seen. Shells did not miss. They followed us wherever we turned. The sea was lit with our comrades burning." From that night onward, Luftwaffe night raids over Normandy dwindled to near zero. Crews simply refused to fly into the maelstrom. Meanwhile, in Italy, radar-controlled VT fuses were proving equally devastating. At Naples in March 1944, German bombers targeted the port. Allied AA units, equipped with SCR-584S, fired hundreds of VT-fused shells. A British officer noted, "In a single night, our guns accounted for 14 enemy aircraft confirmed destroyed. Losses so severe that subsequent raids ceased." At Anzio, where Allied troops were vulnerable on exposed beaches, radar-directed VT fire was credited with preventing Luftwaffe bombers from mounting any sustained offensive. The statistics were chilling. In 1943, radar-directed flak with conventional timed fuses achieved kill rates of 10 to 15% per raid. By mid-1944, with VT fuses, kill rates rose to 20 to 25%. US strategic bombing survey analysts later calculated that the probability of survival for a bomber flying into a heavily defended zone like Normandy or Antwerp in 1944 had dropped to nearly zero. A German officer captured in August 1944 summarized the effect. "It is no longer flak. It is automatic death." By the summer of 1944, the psychological toll was overwhelming. Luftwaffe bomber crews spoke openly of suicide missions. Some deliberately sabotaged their aircraft to avoid flying. German commanders tried to shift raids to twilight or low-level attacks, but radar and VT fuses followed them even there. For Allied gunners, morale soared. No longer did they fire blindly into the night. Every round felt effective, every burst purposeful. A US gunner at Omaha summed it up. "The sky was ours. They had no chance." After the war, at the 1962 US-Japanese Aviation History Symposium, a former Luftwaffe officer admitted, "We did not understand what had happened in 1944. We thought the Allies had discovered some supernatural power. Only later did we learn it was radio waves inside the shell. The Allies had kept the VT fuse secret until the end, fearful the Axis might capture and copy it. By the time Germany realized the truth, the war was nearly over. By late 1944, radar-directed guns with VT fuses had ended the era of traditional night bombing. German bomber units were decimated. Japanese raids across the Pacific collapsed under similar fire. The promise of darkness as protection, the assumption that had guided air war since 1914, was gone forever. What began in 1941 as a surprise at Kiel and Bremen ended in 1944 as an iron law. Radar-guided flak, armed with proximity fuses, made the night sky a killing ground. By early 1945, the Reich was collapsing. On the Eastern Front, Soviet armies pressed into Poland and East Prussia. In the west, Allied forces had crossed the Rhine. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was reduced to fragments of bomber units, battered by fuel shortages, attrition, and hopeless odds. Yet even in these desperate final months, German commanders attempted night bombing raids. The goal was no longer to cripple Allied industry. That possibility had vanished under Allied air supremacy. But to harass, disrupt, and above all, demonstrate that the Luftwaffe still existed. But by 1945, those raids encountered an Allied defence system at its absolute peak. Radar-directed fire control, integrated command networks, and the deadly proximity fuse. On the night of March 3rd to 4th, 1945, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Gazelle, its last major night bombing effort over Britain. Nearly 200 Ju-88 night bombers of KG-54 and KG-51 flew at low altitude across the North Sea, hoping to surprise RAF bomber command bases as British bombers returned from raids over Germany. The plan relied on stealth and timing. But stealth no longer existed. Radar chains along the coast detected the formations before they reached land. SCR 584 sets at airfields fed their data to heavy AA batteries. At RAF Hunsdon, searchlights illuminated the night as German bombers approached. Radar-guided guns opened fire with VT-fused shells. Within minutes, 5 Ju-88s fell burning. Across East Anglia, similar scenes unfolded. One RAF report described it bluntly. Radar-directed fire accounted for the majority of enemy losses. Their attempt at surprise was negated the moment they crossed the coast. German records confirm at least 25 Ju-88s lost in a single night, catastrophic for already exhausted bomber groups. Pilots who survived reported that the flak knew where we were before we did. As the bomber force disintegrated, the Luftwaffe turned to its last technological hope: jet aircraft. The Arado R-234 Blitz, the world's first operational jet bomber, entered service in late 1944. With a top speed of 740 km per hour, it could outrun most Allied fighters. German commanders hoped its speed and small numbers would let it slip through defences, particularly at night. But radar-guided flak proved once again that speed alone could not outwit electronics. On January 1, 1945, an R-234 attempting a reconnaissance flight over Brussels was tracked by Allied radar and destroyed by a salvo of 90mm shells with VT fuses. Allied reports noted, "Jet aircraft intercepted by radar fire control." Despite speed, accuracy ensured kill. It was a chilling demonstration. Even jets, the weapons of the future, were not immune. When Allied forces prepared to cross the Rhine in March 1945, German commanders threw everything they had into disrupting the operation. Luftwaffe bombers, including surviving He-11s and Ju-80s, attempted night attacks on pontoon bridges and ferries. But the crossings were ringed by one of the densest concentrations of radar-directed flak ever assembled. Hundreds of SCR 584s and British GLMK. 3 sets covered every sector, their guns loaded exclusively with VT-fused shells. A US Army debrief from March 24th reported, "Enemy air attack against Remagen bridgehead broken up completely. At least 17 enemy aircraft destroyed by radar predictor-directed AA fire in less than 30 minutes. German survivors described the sky as impenetrable. "Everywhere the fire followed us," one pilot later recalled in post-war interrogation. "The bridges were untouchable." The result was decisive. The Rhine crossings proceeded unhindered, while the Luftwaffe expended its last bomber strength in futile sacrifice. While Germany collapsed, Japan faced the same nightmare. Over Okinawa in spring 1945, Japanese bombers and kamikazes attacked relentlessly. But by then, US forces had fully integrated radar and VT fuses into both naval and land-based AA. US Navy destroyers used SCR-584 radars to direct 5-inch guns, their shells detonating with VT fuses near kamikazes diving at terrifying speeds. Army 90mm guns on Okinawa itself shredded night raiders before they could reach supply dumps. A Japanese officer interrogated in 1946 recalled, "It was hopeless. We no longer believed in the cover of night. Your shells burst beside us even when we thought we had passed unseen." The parallel to Germany was unmistakable. Radar-directed fire had stripped away the ancient bargain of the bomber. That darkness was protection. The numbers tell the final story. By 1945, Allied AA with radar and VT fuses achieved kill rates exceeding 30% per raid in concentrated defense zones. In March-April 1945, Luftwaffe bomber units suffered losses so high that surviving crews refused to fly. KG-54 and KG-51, once proud formations, existed only on paper by May. Japanese bomber units fared no better. Over Okinawa, some raids lost 50% of their strength to radar-guided fire. The US Strategic Bombing Survey concluded, radar-directed AA fire, combined with VT fuses, rendered enemy night bombing impracticable. Losses became prohibitive and morale collapsed. For bomber crews, 1945 was not simply about dying, it was about dying without hope. There was no longer a way to evade, no tactic that guaranteed survival. Whether in a piston-powered Ju-88 or a sleek R-234 jet, the result was the same. Radar tracked, predictor calculated, fuse detonated. Captured Luftwaffe pilot Oberfeldwebel Ernst Köhler said it plainly. "We had no defense. We were cattle in a slaughterhouse." For gunners, the war had reversed. In 1940, they had fired blindly at dots in the sky, hoping for a miracle. By 1945, every trigger pull carried deadly certainty. "It wasn't a guessing game anymore," one US sergeant said after the Rhine battles. "It was execution." By May 1945, Germany surrendered, its bomber force a shattered memory. In August, Japan fell, its air fleets annihilated. In both theatres, the story was the same. Radar had given gunners eyes in the dark, and VT fuses had given shells brains. The night sky, once the bomber's shield, had become its grave. The war ended in ruins, but the memory of those nights, when bombers fell from the dark skies to radar-guided fire, lingered with the men who lived through them. For German pilots, it was a lesson in technological humiliation. For Allied gunners, it was vindication, proof that science and discipline could triumph over fear and chaos. For historians, it became one of the clearest examples of how innovation rewrites the rules of war. Captured German officers, interrogated by Allied intelligence between 1945 and 1946, repeatedly described the psychological shock of radar-controlled flak. Major Dieter von Schilling, formerly of KG-54, told his interrogators, "We knew your fighters at night were dangerous, but at least there we had a chance to dodge. The flak was different. It was impossible. It was invisible. One could feel it following the aircraft, and then suddenly the shells were exploding around us with uncanny precision." Others echoed the theme. Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Schäfer, a Ju-88 pilot, remarked in a 1946 debrief, "When we returned from missions, crews spoke not of bravery or target destruction but of radar. The word alone carried dread. It meant that our skill, our courage, our luck, none of it mattered. Machines were hunting us. The Allies, for their part, preserved a different memory. At the US Army's Air Defense School, returning officers taught classes that drew directly on wartime records. An instructor in 1946 told cadets, "Radar removed the guesswork from anti-aircraft fire. Once mastered, it turned night defense from hope to certainty." In 1947, the US Strategic Bombing Survey published its Pacific and European theatre volumes. Buried in the statistics was the transformation. In 1940, British AA units fired an estimated 20,000 shells for each bomber destroyed. By 1944, with radar and proximity fuses, US and British units averaged 2,500 shells per bomber destroyed, a nearly tenfold improvement. In specific actions, such as the Rhine crossings, kill rates rose above 30% per raid, enough to make operations unsustainable. The numbers were not just dry figures. They testified to the collapse of the Luftwaffe's night bomber arm and explained why the Japanese Army Air Force abandoned night raids after Okinawa. Technology had turned the tables. The impact extended far beyond the immediate war. In post-war NATO planning, radar-controlled air defense became a cornerstone of strategy. Soviet records, later revealed, show that Red Army observers studied German testimonies closely. One Soviet officer wrote in 1947, "The German bomber arm was destroyed not by enemy aircraft, but by radar-directed artillery. This must be understood." In the United States, radar-driven AA networks evolved directly into Cold War air defense systems. The SCR-584 gave way to the Nike missile guidance radars, and the logic of fire control by electronics became standard doctrine. German engineers, many absorbed into Allied research under Operation Paperclip, admitted their awe. Wolfgang Martini, Luftwaffe General of Signals, told an American interviewer in 1946, "Your marriage of radar and gunnery was the true revolution. Jet aircraft impressed us, but radar killed us." In Britain, the memory was personal. Veterans of the Auxiliary Territorial Service, ATS, many of them women who had operated the plotting tables and predictors, recalled the empowerment of technology. Eileen Younghusband, who served on radar stations, later wrote in her memoir, "We could see them coming long before their bombs fell, and when the guns spoke, we knew the invisible beams of radar had guided them. For once, we women at the tables felt we were striking back directly." Londoners remembered the difference too. In 1940, night raids had reigned terror unchecked. By 1943, civilians noticed more German bombers exploding before reaching their targets. "We could cheer the flak now," one East End resident recalled in a BBC oral history. "It wasn't blind banging anymore, it was hitting back." In Germany, the memory was quieter, almost shameful. Former Luftwaffe men who gathered at reunions in the 1950s often avoided the subject of night raids against Britain. When they did speak, it was with bitterness. At a 1962 symposium on air warfare held in Bonn, a former KG-30 pilot summarized, "The enemy's radar decided everything. We were obsolete the moment we took off. For a nation rebuilding under NATO, acknowledging that radar-controlled flak had made their efforts futile was a painful admission, but also a lesson in the futility of fighting technologically superior powers." In Japan, the memory survived in memoirs of kamikaze pilots and their comrades. One pilot, interviewed in 1965, explained, "Even when we dived from the night clouds, their shells burst exactly at our wings. We could not believe such accuracy existed. We thought it was witchcraft." The Japanese post-war aviation press frequently referred to American radar fire as the invisible wall. For many veterans, it symbolized the hopelessness of their late-war struggle. By the 1970s, historians of technology and war had reached consensus. Radar-directed anti-aircraft fire was one of the decisive defensive revolutions of the war. Daniel Hallmann later called it the silent killer of the Luftwaffe's last hope. Arnold Kramer, in his comparative studies, showed that no propaganda effort could overcome the raw mathematics. Where German crews once believed darkness provided cover, radar stripped that away. Where they expected courage to count, it no longer did. The battlefield had been redefined by physics and electronics. Unlike the Spitfire or the B-17, radar-controlled flak never became a symbol in post-war culture. It was too abstract, too technical. But among veterans, the memory endured. At a 1985 Pacific Theater reunion in Hawaii, a U.S. Navy officer raised his glass and said, "To the radar boys, they saw in the dark and they saved our ships." German veterans present at joint commemorations admitted respect, even admiration, for the technology that had defeated them. One Ju-88 crewman told an American counterpart, "We hated you for it then, but now we see it was brilliance." By the late 20th century, radar was everywhere, in airports, weather stations, even in automobiles. Its wartime role as the terror of bomber crews faded into technical history. But for those who had flown through the dark skies of 1941 to 1945, the memory never faded. For the Germans, it was the night the shield of darkness was shattered forever. For the Allies, it was proof that science could turn despair into defense. For historians, it remains a lesson that wars are not won only by courage, but by the invisible revolutions of technology. In the end, the story of radar-controlled guns shooting bombers from the night sky is not just about loss or victory. It is about the transformation of war itself, from the guesswork of men to the precision of machines, from the superstition of darkness to the certainty of electronic light. When the guns fell silent in 1945, radar-controlled anti-aircraft fire had already proven itself one of the most decisive, if least celebrated, technologies of the war. Its influence did not stop with the surrender of Germany and Japan. The invisible beams that had tracked Heinkels and Ju-88s across the Channel and shredded kamikazes before they struck Pacific warships laid the foundation for a new era of electronic warfare that would dominate the Cold War. Captured German officers told their Soviet counterparts the same things they had confessed to the Americans and British. Radar had destroyed the night bomber. The Red Army listened carefully. In 1946, Soviet intelligence filed a detailed report on British GL Mark II and American SCR-584 radars, noting, "Enemy flak became accurate at night beyond expectation. Radar-directed artillery must be considered decisive in defense of homeland industry." By the 1950s, Soviet designers were fielding their own radar-controlled guns, the S-60-57mm system linked to Son-9 fire control radars. These weapons would later terrify NATO pilots over Korea and Vietnam, proving that the German pilot's nightmare in 1941 had become a universal condition of modern air warfare. For the United States, radar-directed gunnery provided the stepping stone to missiles. Engineers who had worked on SCR-584 radars transitioned into the Nike surface-to-air missile program. By 1953, the U.S. Army could track and intercept jet bombers at ranges undreamed of in 1941. The Air Defense Command's motto after 1945 might as well have been born in the dark nights of the Blitz. What you cannot see, radar will. In Britain, radar was memorialized less as a weapon than as a savior. The narrative of the radar miracle, from Chain Holmes' early warning to GL Set's guiding guns, became a central part of national pride. In 1957, when the British government issued its Defence White Paper arguing that missiles would replace manned aircraft, it cited the wartime radar experience as proof that electronics, not pilots, had saved cities. Though controversial, the point reflected a deep cultural memory. Technology, not flesh and blood, had stopped the bombers. In Germany, radar-controlled flak remained a subject of uneasy silence. Luftwaffe veterans admitted in private that it had broken their morale, but public discussion remained muted. To acknowledge it was to admit that German bravery and sacrifice had been futile against Anglo-American science. In Japan, the memory blended into the larger story of technological inferiority. Japanese officers, interrogated in 1946, repeatedly described American radar as magic. By the 1960s, Japanese aviation writers referred to kamikazes being erased by invisible beams. It was less history than myth, but the effect was the same. Radar stood as proof that the war had been unwinnable. For the men who had faced it in the air, the memory was visceral. Hans Richter, a surviving Ju-88 navigator, told an interviewer in 1972, "We would fly over London at night and suddenly the flak was bursting exactly on our altitude, as if they could see our instruments. It was not like the old days when flak was random. We felt hunted. We felt naked." On the other side, American gunners remembered pride in their machines. Sergeant Bill Crawford, who had manned a 90mm battery in Antwerp in 1944, recalled, "The radar scope gave us their position, the computer gave us the solution, and the shells went where they were supposed to. It was the first time I felt the enemy was the one in the dark, not us." The legacy of radar-guided fire was not merely psychological, it shaped the architecture of post-war militaries. The electronic computer that solved flak equations evolved into digital fire control systems. Radar beams that once directed 90mm shells now guided Nike and Hawk missiles, then Patriot and S-300 systems. Every Cold War pilot who faced a radar lock-on in Vietnam or the Middle East was, in a sense, reliving what German crews had first experienced in 1941. The helpless feeling of being tracked by an unseen hand, precision mathematics calculating their destruction. By the 1980s, military historians had finally given radar-controlled flak its due. Richard Overy wrote that the silent revolution of radar was not only in air combat, but in artillery. It transformed flak from random noise into a deadly science. Others emphasized its moral impact. The Luftwaffe had once believed night was their ally. Radar stripped that illusion away. Historian Daniel Hallman summarized, "Radar was more than a weapon. It was the death of the German night offensive as a concept. Today, few visitors to war museums notice the radar trailers and fire control sets tucked between aircraft and tanks. The SCR-584 at the Smithsonian, the GLMK. 2 at Duxford gather dust compared to the glamour of Spitfires or Mustangs. Yet their story is one of decisive power. The Ju-88 displayed at Hendon carries the scars of flak hits from 1943. Next to it stands a modest panel. German crews called it invisible fire. It was radar. That phrase sums up the entire transformation. The night that once protected the bomber had become the night that betrayed it. Radar-controlled guns were never as romantic as fighters, never as iconic as tanks. But they embodied the cold logic of industrial war. Science applied relentlessly to the problem of killing. For German pilots, they marked the moment when courage ceased to matter. For Allied defenders, they proved that intellect could shield cities. The story of those guns is ultimately the story of modern war itself. Invisible, mathematical, relentless. Wars would no longer be decided only by human daring, but by the precision of machines humming in the dark. And so the German pilots' lament was true. They never expected radar-controlled guns to shoot them down at night. But once they appeared, the outcome was irreversible. The night itself had changed sides.